Thanks for doing that, everyone. And I'm just going to start the talk properly now. So, last April, I found myself stuck to the Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy. I had deliberately superglued my hand to the window and put up a load of scientific papers, along with, there was about 20 of us scientists there that day, and we were doing this to protest the government's continued licensing of new fossil fuel projects in the North Sea. So, what on earth would lead me, an Earth system scientist, and normally utterly law-abiding person, to do such a thing? Well, I think the story starts here, in Bangor, or more precisely, in the Nanfrancon, where I grew up. You can actually see pretty much where my house was, where I was a child, in the trees at the bottom of the valley. But the Ogwen Valley means an awful lot to me. And it was growing up here that I learned to study the nature and the geology of the valley, and to try and understand more about it. And I'd climb the hills, and I'd learn their names, Penarolawen, Gliddervawr, Gliddervawr. And I'd go up there and I'd sit and I'd think about what were the forces that created these valleys. How were they shaped? Why do they take the form that they do? And as we all know, they're shaped as glacial valleys, right? They're formed by glaciers. And so, 20,000 years ago, if you were sat here on top of Penarolawen, you would have been surrounded by a sea of ice. 20,000 years ago, the temperature of the planet was so much lower that the entire valley was chock-a-block full, and where my house was would have been under about half a mile of ice. So the planet can change. It can change really dramatically and drastically into very different states. Some of them quite inhospitable. We wouldn't be here right now if the temperature was as cold as it was back then 20,000 years ago. When we see these valleys today, this is what it would have looked like. This is in Antarctica, right? So the ice is there now, but it's not here anymore. And we know that most of Europe was underneath one of these giant ice sheets, and as a result, the entire ecosystems around those ice sheets were completely different. So right across Central Europe was a tundra, so France and so on. That's what it's like up in Norway and the Arctic, where I used to work today, right? And Spain and Italy were coniferous forests, taiga forests, like is today in Siberian Arctic and across Canada. Okay, the world was very, very different, and the entire species that were adapted in any given location had to be very different, and over time these species migrated to where they are today. And we know that humans were around at that time, living in caves, painting these animals in France and in Spain and so on, showing you just how different the world was back then than it is today. And we were having to be really adaptable and move with those herds as time changed, right? But today we're all really settled as our civilization has developed and adapted to the climate that we live in today, and all of the cities are based at that kind of sea level and where the ports are, and everything has kind of built itself to the last 10,000 years of climate. And these are the swings for the last ice ages, and we know, as was said earlier on, that the temperature difference between the depths of the last ice age, when this valley was covered in ice, and the pre-industrial temperatures of the 1800s, was only about 4.5 to 5.5 degrees Celsius on the global average. It doesn't sound like very much, but that small amount of temperature can make an absolutely phenomenal difference to the entire planet. We are now looking at warming this planet 3.5 to 4 degrees Celsius this century. So the amount of change that the planet went through within 10,000 years is going to happen in 100 years. So that's 1,000 times faster, right? The rate of change is completely unprecedented. And we're seeing that, the coupling here between carbon dioxide, the greenhouse gas, and the temperature of the planet, and just how tightly those things move in lockstep, right? look at what we're doing to the carbon dioxide at the end of that graph. It's just going straight up like never before. And the temperature is going to follow, right? So that's the situation that we're getting ourselves in. So my research had led me to the Arctic, and it was focused on environmental change, as was said. And I was there as part of an interdisciplinary team examining the effects that the increasingly frequent and severe wildfires are having on the carbon cycle and the stores of carbon in the Arctic ecosystems. In particular, I wanted to know how the permafrost, which is permanently frozen soils, were responding to the increasingly frequent wildfires that we're seeing in those ecosystems. So the Arctic is now warming roughly 3 up to 4 times faster than the rest of the planet, and that rate of change puts the Arctic ecosystems and their communities on the front lines of the climate crisis. So what this graph is showing you is this photo. So this is showing you a core of soil that we took in the Arctic, and you can see here there's a layer of moss on top of the soil core, and that layer of moss acts as a kind of insulating blanket that helps keep the soils cool in the summertime, right? So the heat is lost in the winter and then stays frozen, and the mosses help keep that insulated and cooled. When a fire comes through, it scorches off the entire top layer of the humus layer and all the mosses, and then you're then exposing this dark layer, which can then thaw out much more quickly. And so that's the process that we were really interested in, because that then can accelerate the amount of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases that come out of the Arctic soils. So whilst on field work, I met a firefighter, a volunteer firefighter, and he was a member of one of the First Nations communities that live up in that part of the Northwest Territories. And he was exhausted. He explained to me that in the past, fires were a rare occurrence, and he might only have to go out a few days each summer. But that summer, he had been away from home for many months, fighting blaze after blaze. And the forest was so hot and dry that the fires were erupting everywhere. So he went on to tell me that, these changes were affecting his entire community and their entire way of life. So particularly important there is the ability to kind of drive up lorries of goods in the wintertime across ice lakes that are frozen so thick that you can drive heavy laden lorries right across the frozen lakes, right? Well, it's not getting cold enough for long enough for those lakes to freeze thickly enough for those lorries to carry on going up there anymore. And so as a result, the drivers are having to go really long ways around, which puts up the price of the goods massively, and that's affecting them hugely. But also, their ability to go and fish on these lakes is becoming compromised. Traditionally, his community would go out and they'd drill holes in the ice and then they'd fish on them. And they're just not able to do that because it's too dangerous for many parts of the year. And so the window of time that they have to go ice fishing is just shrinking and shrinking. He was also explaining how the air pollution was getting so bad from the wildfires that the children in the communities were developing breathing problems. The hospitals would become overwhelmed in the summer times when they'd have people with all sorts of asthma attacks and other things. And the city where we were doing our field work was a place called Yellowknife, and the summer that we were up there, as I said, the fires were absolutely crazy. The whole city of about 50,000 people, it's the largest settlement in the area, had to almost be evacuated because the fires almost entered the city limits. This is, like I said, in the Arctic, right? This shouldn't be happening. So the Arctic Circle is burning, and what I saw really terrified me. And I've been watching these emissions go up and up and up my entire life. We've just reached a new record high for the levels of constant CO2 in the atmosphere. Emissions actually last year were the highest ever globally. We're not going down. And so, I look at my nieces and my nephews who'll grow up over the next couple of decades. And in this time, they'll go through the incredible process of coming to know the world and themselves in it. They will imagine their future, who they'll fall in love with, what job they'll have, where they'll live, as the world is falling apart around them. So you're probably here because you've seen the headlines, and you might have read some of the reports. Reports like this one from the IPCC. Millions of people have read those same headlines, and now almost everyone knows that the climate crisis is real, and it is scary. But most of the people are not here, and most of them probably didn't read, for example, that the UN's most recent report, which is saying that we have a brief and rapidly closing window of opportunity to secure a livable future. So let's just think about what that means for a second. All the evidence has been put together, it's been analysed, and the conclusion is that we are very quickly running out of time. A closing window of opportunity is talking about a place that we can't come back from. It's talking about passing tipping points, like the loss of the ice at the North and South Poles, that reflect the sun's heat, or the loss of rainforests that absorb the planet's carbon. And